Black victim. Montgomery's latest homicide victim had history with narcotics abuse, tangles with the law. Does anyone see anything particularly wrong with this? Let's look at this next slide. White suspect. Son in Staten Island murders was brilliant, athletic, but his demons were the death of his parents. Does anyone see anything wrong here in particular? In in this situation, the white suspect is seen in a much more positive light, though there is the big possibility and confirmation that he committed these murders. Whereas the black victim, if we're looking back at it, was portrayed in a much more negative light, considering that he is black in particular, and that he had run-ins with the law regardless, as if his death in itself was eventually going to come regardless. It's like as if he had it coming himself. Major media outlets such as MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, ABC, The Huntington Post, any major mainstream media news outlet has had a major problem in properly representing different races and ethnicities in the media nowadays. We look at these news reports and we see that these races and particular individuals who identify with whether it be a minority or a majority race, how they're underrepresented in their certain aspects. Take white individuals for instance. Research has shown that they are more overrepresented as police officers rather than they are perpetrators. Whereas it's the opposite in terms of Latinos or African Americans, who are seen more as perpetrators rather than police officers, which is pretty interesting. Now, these particular news outlets, with their narratives, promote and reinforce these stereotypes and racism. And in particular, many individuals gather together to fight against these stereotypes and to go against what society has deemed wrong, etc., etc. But the biggest issue upon this is that not only do we gather to fight against these stereotypes and racial discriminations that each and every one of us have gone through, it's interesting to see the perspectives that are shown when these stereotypes are reinforced. Take these three pictures, for instance. If you look if you look to the left, you'll see that a Latino, or preferably a Mexican, is dressed up in a serape, sombrero, mustache, and a cigar, which is a stereotypical version of what you would identify as a Latino. Me personally, as a Latino, I don't really walk around the house in a serape and a sombrero. But the biggest issue upon this is that this particular stereotype is reinforced when there's an underrepresentation of what we truly are. We're not all criminals, we're not all drunks, but media doesn't show much diversity. Take the picture on the right with the four African American men. They're particularly presented in a light where they seem to be gangbangers or thugs. But that's not their identifier either. These stereotypes are reinforced when there is underrepresentation. Many African Americans happen to be police officers and gain many different achievements, but particularly white suspects are more represented as a happier and more positive outlet rather than an African American who is represented more as if they are being demonized, as if whether they're victims or not, they particularly had it coming. Take this picture of a white family, for instance. When trying to find a particular photo that showed white people in particular in a more dangerous light, many pictures did not pop up unless they were pictures of shooters who happened to have committed crimes in the past. But the issue with that is that many of them in the media were deemed mentally unstable rather than their proper name, or their proper title, such as terrorist, who committed acts of terror in light of their personal beliefs. Now, these stereotypes that have been enforced in society, it's due to all the representation that media outlets have. They portray their narratives in a way where we have no choice but to think upon what these racial stereotypes are showing. And yes, many of these stereotypes unfortunately happen to be true, but not everyone is in this light. We cannot generalize certain races. And the particular issue with generalizing these races is that we see them in a different perspective, a perspective that can possibly be dangerous to our own well being, when in particular they aren't. These next two slides show a bit of a dramatization of, of how stereotypes have been enforced in our everyday life, particularly with an African American woman and a Latino male. In this video, you saw as my friend Ruben ran away from a young African American woman who had been dressed in her own particular way, but who just simply wanted to sit down next to him, and how he ran off. This dramatization may be over exaggerating, but in particular shows a bit of the actual stigma that African Americans typically have when they're overrepresented as thugs or criminals.
Hi, ¿qué tal, negra? ¿Cómo estás, güey? ¡Ey! ¿Quieres marihuana?
No.
Cocaína.
Okay, buddy, you okay?
¿Quieres tomar? ¡Viva México!
This particular video shows how the stereotypes of Mexicans is usually portrayed in. Many Mexicans in particular happen to be seen as drunks or criminals just as much as African Americans, but in fact we particularly have the stigma of being more wasted than most races and ethnicities. These stereotypes in particular, as terrible as they can be, they do gather us together when we come up and fight for different causes, such as Black Lives Matter. After certain shootings in areas like Baltimore and Ferguson, riots stood up, and Black Lives Matter rose up to help defend these particular African American victims that were going through loss and whatnot, that were going through racial discrimination amongst their own kind, among Caucasian Americans or police officers in particular. The aspect of police brutality, it has shown how these stereotypes have been enforced to the point where we don't even feel safe within our own law enforcement, and that in particular is a big issue. I thank you for listening. And if you have any other questions, or if you would like to know more information, you can log on to my own Google site, where there is a blog and a research paper that has been produced to show more light on this particular instance. My name is Brian Jensen Camaro. Thank you for listening.